Welcome back. So this is continuation of the lecture on illustration. And like I said, when we last left off, we were talking about the golden age of illustration. And I want to just to explain that some things were happening in the 19th century that led to this sort of golden age. One of them is that with the improving technology of printmaking and photo reproduction, artists were able to make artwork of various means, such as make oil paintings or pen drawings or pencil drawings, and have them um, much more faithfully reproduced for publication in a magazine or in a book. And another photography at the same time was also really useful for illustrators because it allowed them to get quick sources to work from, and so that because illustrators of the 19th century and early 20th century had to work on very fast turnaround times. And so having, like let's say in this case, being able to hire a model and get a photo source allowed an illustrator to do a job like this in a 1 week or 2 week period, where that imagery for an 18th century artist would have just been assumed to have been a month worth of work. Um, and there were also modern developments of materials, but many of these people, such as Howard Pyle and N.C. Wyeth, primarily worked in very traditional art materials, in oil paint, sometimes in watercolors. Um, and these are some of the most classic types of illustrations. We see some examples of historical illustrations, but also of kind of um, you know fantasy story illustrations for kids, things like pirates or King Arthur. N.C. Wyeth is a favorite of mine. We've seen a number of images of him. We've seen this image before. There was another image of his earlier in this lecture. And truly one of the great American painters. And had an amazing sense of color, very much influenced by what was going on in the fine art world as well. And I think that's another point I want to make, is that sometimes it's easy to view illustration as being lesser than the fine and studio arts, but there's always been, since the 19th century, this back and forth between the two. And these artists, they may have been working under a much faster turnaround time, but they certainly were aware of what was going on in the rest of the art world. Aubrey Beardsley is what a strange looking guy, and what amazing artwork. He's probably not necessarily the most famous to your everyday person. I would say probably Norman Rockwell is probably that, but for art historians, probably the most famous illustrator, the most, in some ways, most highly respected. Has such an amazing sense of design. Maxfield Parrish is also an incredibly well-respected illustrator and painter, and just had a wonderful sense of light in his works. So another point I want to make, besides just talking about the golden age of illustration, is and how illustration became such an important part of the art world. And keep in mind that today, the vast majority of people employed in the arts are employed in applied and commercial arts, and that studio arts is a small part of the marketplace of the arts. And it really starts with these 19th century illustrators, these golden age illustrators. And like I said, a lot of it had to do, this explosion of illustration had a lot to do with an explosion in publications, magazines and publishing houses, books and newspapers, an explosion in reproductive means by which color images and full subtle gray tones could be reproduced carefully, and this is an explosion in tools and resources by which illustrators could work quickly. But I also wanted to talk about different kinds of illustration. So mostly up to this point we've been looking at narrative illustration that's part of storytelling. And a subset of that would be editorial illustration, like the type of illustration you see that would support a magazine article, especially magazine articles that have a strong editorial point of view. But another major aspect of illustration is scientific illustration and diagrammatic illustrations, where the point of them is to explain things clearly. And something that a lot of people don't necessarily understand is that a photograph is not nearly as clear as a really good illustration, or a really good drawing for that matter. And this is a perfect example of it. This engine illustration right here. There's no way a photograph could explain the complicated workings of an illustration of an engine and show clearly all the different parts and how they interconnect nearly as clearly as this illustration can. And it takes a brain to figure out how to make those things clear and understandable from and what exact point of view. Whereas a camera, it just sees shapes of light and dark. It doesn't see with the brain, and so it wouldn't be anywhere near as successful. I think that's a good place to end part 2.